To understand the profound link between the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR movement, and Christian identity, one must first recognize the movement's strong ties to the nation of Israel. Predecessors were, and are still, obsessed with apocalyptic predictions. As proponents of Christian Zionism, they closely associate these predictions with events in Israel's historical timeline, past, present, and future. This connection becomes deeply troubling when we consider some of these predictions, in light of the racial and anti-Semitic components associated with Christian identity. For example, NAR leader Mike Bickle predicted that a second Jewish Holocaust would unfold just before the end of days. Bickle, a prominent Christian Zionist within the movement, echoed voices of Christian identity extremists when he declared, quote, "The tribulation is not something that happens to us, the tribulation is something that happens through us." Though his statement was certainly not intended with the same tones of anti-Semitism of the more violent leaders of Christian identity, as we continue to examine the source of the doctrine, it most certainly developed from the same foundation. John Hagee, a prominent ally of NAR leaders, founded Christians United for Israel, CUFI, and hosts annual CUFI Washington summits. He is known for adding a racial component to his Christian Zionist beliefs. According to Hagee, Jews are not included in the gospel of Jesus Christ and are saved by their race, rather than through grace. This notion is referred to as a dual covenant, which closely resembles the two-seed or dual seed doctrine associated with Christian identity and white supremacy. While Hagee claims that this doctrine supports Jews, denying them access to the gospel is truly anti-Semitic and goes against the teachings of the biblical Apostle Paul in Romans 1 verse 16. Though it has evolved over time, these unusual beliefs emerged as a result of the latter rain movement of 1948, which many leaders of the NAR refer to as a movement inspired by God. That movement came to be known as Latter Rain, due to the formation of the nation of Israel in May 1948. Adherents believed that Israel and the Latter Rain movement was the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy of Joel. Many leaders of the movement had strong ties to British Israelism, and key figures in Latter Rain were affiliated with Christian identity organizations, such as the Anglo-Saxon Federation. The leader of the revival that sparked the Latter Rain movement, William Branham, held strong ties to key figures in both British Israelism and Christian identity. Branham was one of the strongest supporters of Christian identity's dual seed theology, which he branded as the serpent seed and predicted a coming war between races. Hagee appears to have simply repeated Branham's anti-Semitic doctrines, excluding the Jewish race from the gospel of Jesus Christ. How did this belief in Christianity's ties to Israel begin? Why did ministers come to believe that ancient biblical prophecy could be repurposed from their original context to the 20th and 21st centuries? To answer this question, we must first examine a series of events that happened between officials in Scotland and the Catholic Church during the early 1300s. During the First War of Scottish Independence in 1317, only about 30 years after the ending of the Crusades, Pope John XXII imposed a truce between England and Scotland. Neither Scotland nor England fully accepted the pontiff's demand, though threats of religious persecution by the Catholic Church temporarily brought restraint. King Robert I of Scotland, otherwise known as Robert the Bruce, refused to abandon his campaign against English control of Scotland. Bruce had already been excommunicated from the Catholic Church by Pope Clement V for murdering John Comyn, Bruce's rival heir to the Scottish throne. Bruce envisioned uniting Scotland and Ireland to create a pan-Gaelic Greater Scotia, and cared very little for the demands from Rome. After having successfully raided and recaptured most of the castles in Scotland under English control, that vision was close to reality. Bruce forced England to recognise his crown by uniting Scots and invading northern England and Ireland to liberate the people of the British Isles from the ruthless King Edward II of England. The Scots and Irish razed English-controlled villages and towns until famine struck Ireland and depleted critical supplies. Struggling to survive, the army resorted to pillaging both English and Irish settlements. The devastation came to an end when Bruce's brother Edward was killed at the Battle of Fort. By that time, however, Robert the Bruce had sent a message to the world that he was King of Scotland, and Scotland was no longer under Edward's domain. On April 6, 1320, the world's first Declaration of Independence was penned at Arbroath Abbey and signed by 8 earls and 31 barons of Scotland. It was written as a response to Pope John XXII on behalf of Robert the Bruce for his excommunication and for disobeying the Pope's demand for a truce, and in no uncertain terms, declared that the independence of Scotland was the prerogative of the Scottish people, not simply the King of Scotland. The document outlined the history of the Scots and their victories over invading nations from England in the 1300s, dating back to antiquity. In that history was an unusual claim that the history of the Scots could be traced back to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, suggesting that Scotland could not be defeated because the Scots were of the royal seed of Abraham and blessed by God himself. While the world recognizes the historical value of the document as the oldest known Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Arbroath holds significant historical value for a lesser-known group of people, converts to the British Israel movement. It is the oldest known declaration of British Israelism, the belief that the people of the British Isles are the direct descendants of the biblical Israel. The letter sent to Pope John XXII was but one of many instances where direct lineage to the children of Israel was declared, and the notion eventually developed into a sect of Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups focused on apocalypticism. British Israelites believed the lost tribes of Israel had migrated to the British Isles and were God's chosen people, protected by God and unconquerable. The movement gained a strong foothold during the 19th and 20th centuries in Great Britain and abroad, with the formation of hundreds of different British Israel organizations. In the early 1900s, the movement became more radicalized as it transitioned to Christian identity, and the underlying themes of racial discrimination began to surface. From its inception, British Israelism was a political movement aligned with the statement made in the Declaration of Arbroath. British Israelites believed that God's blessings to Israel in the Old Testament were promises made to the people of the British Isles, including promises concerning military conquest and defense. Both the biblical blessings and biblical curses were included in the ideology, including curses placed against any nation that opposed Israel. In the late 1800s, as the movement became more formalized, it adopted the lineage through Scythia, described in the Arbroath letter. British Israel historians have declared that the lost 10 tribes of Israel were transferred to Babylon about 720 BC, around the same time the Scythians appeared in the same district. They then transferred into Denmark before landing in the British Isles. King James VI of England was so devoted to the British Israel ideology that he commissioned an English translation of the Bible, known as the King James Version. English nobility at that time were trained from an early age that the lineage of English royalty could be traced to the biblical King David through Fergus I and the kings of Ireland. As the British Israel ideology began to form in England, the King James Version was widely adopted as the authoritative translation, and James' belief in the biblical promises to Israel, being applied to then modern-day England, was adopted through literal interpretation of the text in that translation. British Israel converts argued that England and its colonies must be the Israel to whom the promises were given, otherwise, those promises were unfulfilled. British Israelism developed into an ideology outside of English nobility in the late 1700s through a mentally unstable lieutenant in the British Navy named Richard Brothers. In 1790, during what appeared to be a severe mental health incident, Brothers sent letters to the King of England, ministers of state, and the Speaker of the House of Commons, declaring himself to be called by God to fulfill the prophecy from Daniel 7 of the Old Testament. This revelation led to his proclamation that the king would die, and the crown of England given to Brothers as the nephew of the Almighty and Prince of the Hebrews, appointed to lead them to the land of Canaan. Brothers wrote 15 books on the British Israel theory while making political predictions as a self-proclaimed prophet. Some of the predictions apparently came true, attracting numerous followers to his cause. He convinced several of them into selling their property to accompany him to New Jerusalem, which he planned to build on both sides of the Jordan River in 1795. Though he was eventually committed to Bedlam as a raving lunatic, his work towards spreading the British Israel idea was somewhat successful, and others carried the torch. In the mid-1840s, the British Israel concept developed into a movement through the work of John Wilson, a self-educated son of a radical Irish weaver. Wilson lectured throughout Ireland and England on the origins of the nations of Northern Europe, which he claimed were Israelitish. A series of 5 editions of lectures were published beginning in 1840, entitled Lectures on Our Israelitish Origin. Wilson linked the British and other Teutonic peoples in his Israelite origin histories, a notion that was somewhat common in political themes of his era. Even among English scholars and German philologists, the notion of a shared Indo-European origin was growing increasingly popular. The Germans attempted to trace the languages of both nations to a common source, and the search for that source was an attempt to find the origins of the Aryan race. The British Israel movement would have fizzled out in England had it not been for the work of Edward Hine, who converted to the movement after hearing a lecture by Wilson at the age of 15. 5 years prior to Wilson's 5th edition of Lectures on Our Israelitish Origin release, Hine published his Identity of the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel with the Anglo-Celto-Saxons. The book was highly successful, selling over 250,000 copies. Like Wilson, Hine viewed himself as a spiritual authority linked to the Old Testament. While editing his Banner of Israel magazine, Hine asserted that he was the deliverer that would come out of Zion to bring the glory of the Lord to Israel. Hine was also effective in spreading the British Israel doctrine into the United States due to key differences between his theology and that of Wilson. While Wilson was satisfied that the people of the British Isles had descended from Israel, Hine declared that the tribe of Ephraim embodied the 10 lost tribes as a consolidated people, while the tribe of Manasseh lay outside of the British Isles. Hine eventually developed the idea that the tribe of Manasseh migrated to the United States and that the union between the two nations constituted all of Israel. Within this unusual doctrine, concerning the link between the United States and the tribe of Manasseh, the story of the NAR begins. The religious and political issues of the late 1800s and early 1900s were very much an open field for planting such an idea. When British Israelism was adopted by the early leaders of the Pentecostal movement and began to spread, British Israelism quickly changed the way religious leaders understood both the Bible canon and their world view.